Tēnā koutou, and welcome to our participants in this webinar in New Zealand and overseas. My name is Karen Smith. I am Professor of Tourism Management at Wellington School of Business and Government, and I'll be the chair for today's webinar. This is the fourth in a series hosted by the School of Management, and thank you to the team working behind the scenes. Particularly today we've got Abby Hart who's helping us. We're also recording today's session as well. So today's webinar is on the role of food tourism in reimagination of New Zealand's tourism post-COVID-19. Food and wine are right at the centre of the experience economy, whether or not it be dining out, cellar door visits or food festivals. Food and drink have an important role to play in our lives, in our communities and in tourism. But what might food tourism look like as we strive to reimagine New Zealand's tourism in a post-COVID-19 world? Well, today we're joined by three food tourism experts to explore this very question. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Ian Yeoman, Associate Professor of Tourism Futures here at Wellington School of Business and Government. His most recent publication is The Future Paths of Tourism, and his edited collections include books on food tourism in Asia and the future of food tourism. Those who joined us for last week's webinar will know he has expertise in scenario planning, and today he'll draw on this background to discuss food tourism trends post-COVID-19. Ian will be followed by our second speaker, Dr. Joanna Fountain. She joins us today from the South Island of New Zealand, where she's Senior Lecturer in Tourism Management at Lincoln University and a Senior Researcher in the Resilience to Nature's Challenges National Science Challenge. She's a diverse range of research interests, but is primarily focused on utilising agri-food networks and forms of agri-tourism, including food and wine attractions and events, as tools for building rural resilience in the face of rapid change. Joel speaks second, and she's going to talk about the potential of food and tourism experiences in a post-COVID-19 environment. And then our third speaker is Sarah Meikle, who is CEO of Wellington Culinary Events Trust and Festival Director of New Zealand's largest culinary festival, Visa Wellington on a Plate, which I'm sure many Kiwis and particularly Wellingtonians are excited to hear has been rescheduled to October. She's also event director of Beervana, the Road to Beervana and Highball. And prior to this, Sarah worked with Positively Wellington Tourism and Tourism New Zealand. Now, Sarah's just returned from a road trip adventure to the East Cape of the North Island, where I'm sure she sampled lots of foodie experiences. And this fits really well with her topic today, which is food tourism's moment in New Zealand's sun. Each speaker is going to be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then there will be time for moderated questions. You can ask questions as we go through, although we'll leave answering those until the end. And to do that, you just use the Q&A on the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once questions start to appear, you can also upvote others' questions, and I'll draw from those when we come back to the speakers at the end. So, without no further ado, I'm going to pass on to our first speaker, Ian Yeoman, who's going to explore some of the exciting food tourism trends. Kia ora, Ian.
Kia ora. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, colleagues. Without doubt, there's two different worlds today. There was a world prior to COVID-19 and there's a world post-COVID-19. And as COVID-19 has been a big disruptor on all types of businesses, whether you're in food, tourism, or manufacturing, there's no doubt about that. So the question asks, how does food tourism change in a post-COVID world? And that's the purpose of today's presentation.
Sorry, Ian, we've actually lost you. I think you've gone on to mute, so I'll just get you unmuted. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, that's fine, sorry. The key question to ask is, what is resilience? And resilience is a good way to test the depth of a trend and how it will change and what its impact. And here I draw upon a framework which uses Albert Postman's work on COVID-19 and James Dayton's work on alternative futures, where we talk about what is the impact of change in the terms of recession, and what is the nature of the change and where the focus is. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I put this into a framework. Next slide, please. So what if? What if food tourism changes? What would that world look like? What would the festival be? What would the trend be in the terms of going forward? It's the degree of change I want to consider. Next slide, please. What I'm going to look at is you can easily map the stages of COVID-19, when it first began to when it disappears. So four scenarios for a framework. Collapse and decline represents the end of tourism. Transition means COVID-19 is here. The colony, the present situation around level 2 and 3. Transformation, thinking about a better world, thinking about a better future, or a revival world about celebration, because we're out of it completely and it's trying to get back to normal, what we were before COVID-19. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is COVID-19 is here. It takes us back to basics. When we talk about back to basics, one of the core theories to look at is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The sense of security, the sense of safety, psychological needs of water, warmth, rest, because we went back to basics when COVID-19 arrived. It wasn't about economic well-being. It wasn't about getting out and doing things. It was about you and me and our relationship with friends and family and what is priority. So from a tourism perspective, next slide, please. What we saw in here was basically, we saw the collapse of tourism. There was no tourism. Across the world, we saw all major events or gatherings of more than two or three people. They were just banned. They just didn't happen because it was against the health and advice of your government. Tourism stopped, collapse and decline. Next slide, please. Some of the trends that came out of that in the terms of how we felt in this world of basicness, in the world of simplicity, is safety became really important. Hygiene became really important. It was right at the top of your conversation and where you were. The other concept that came out was the sense of distance, social distancing, wash your hands. And some of the things that are coming out of this in the terms of trends that become more important, for example, will be about labor supply and automation. Because when we're in this world of transition, COVID-19 is here, COVID-19 is around us, it means we live in a different world. This is the world of level 2 or level 3, where we're aware of the virus and how we manage it. So automation becomes important. Technology becomes important as that labor substitute. Next slide, please. And at the same time, what comes out of this basic needs, our thinking about our value systems changes. It's going back to basics. It's a world of simplicity, value, meeting locals, lots of free time and bargains. Our attitude to life has gone through a process of rethinking and what's important to us, how we're talking about it. And that's the present sense of where we are and how we're connecting with people and what we're doing, which I think one of my colleagues, Dr. Joanne Fountain, will go into greater detail about. So what does it mean if we have a revival or transformation? Next slide, please. So revival and transformation takes us further up Maslow's hierarchy of need. Psychological needs around belongingness and love. So the key question is, who do we love? It's about intimate relationship with friends and family. It's about us in society. So examples of this, it's about what we do from a food tourism perspective and that relationship. Next slide, please. So let us think about how food takes us into that different world. Here it's the world of social responsibility, thinking about others. And from a food tourism perspective, we've always had that strong connection about how can we use food for the betterment of society. And a classical example of that is the Clink restaurants in London. The Clink restaurants in London are restaurants run by the prisoners for the public. It's a way that we give back, where celebrity chefs and chefs come in and they help people. And they're a restaurant which are about betterness, about helping people, and we engage with that. Next slide, please. What happens if it's about revival? The other trend that happens in this revival is the trend of fluid identity. This takes us back to pre-COVID-19. This takes us to a world where COVID-19 has disappeared and we just want to get back to normal. And fluid identity is a concept from a food tourism perspective. It's not about a foodie or a gastro tourist, those interested in food. This is the average tourist. This is the tourist that goes to Wellington on a plate, and from my perspective, they want a sample. They want something new. They want an experience. They're not a foodie, but they want to be excited. They want that novelty. So they're willing to try something different, a lot more hedonic in the terms of that food tourism trend. Next slide, please. So it's about challenging. One of the questions I've got to ask in this revival world is, what is the role of science, and how can science help? How would science contribute to a new food tourism? So a couple of examples from science are about A2 milk, which you can buy from any supermarket or dairy, or Tamana milk. This is about reshaping a tourism product in a natural way to focus on certain elements around better diet. It's about high value. So it's asking the question, what would that tourist pay more for? Or what do they see in the terms of that added value? And it's about putting science into food and its perspective on tourism. So reshaping a product or an experience that's high value. Next slide, please. And looking at that, one of the other things that we think about science and that change is about, talk about seasonality in the terms of when to eat something and when not to eat something, when it's in season and the price. But what happens if we link seasonality to taste? Linking seasonality at the right time to kill a cow or to kill a sheep for us to eat. How does gender affect or change the taste of the food? So looking at seasonality in food beyond when it becomes available, but looking at from a taste perspective, again as an example of this, I will try something new, bringing science into food to improve the meal experience, is what it's all about. Wellington on a Plate is the world's most successful food festival in my eyes. So as a consequence of that, next slide, please. It's about bringing businesses along. We know about Wellington and its burgers. So what about in 2030 that McDonald's wins the Wellington on a Plate Restaurant of the Year? It's something new. They just want to be part of that chain. And actually, it's happened. McDonald's have done pop-up restaurants with the theme Restaurant M. And they've done that in Tokyo Food Festivals. So next slide, please. Anyway, that's me. A quick overview of food trends and how they shape the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for giving us some thought-provoking introductions to some of the futures we might look at in terms of food tourism. So I'm now going to pass on to Dr. Joanna Fountain, and who's going to explore the potential of food in tourism experiences. Jo, welcome. Jo, you've got your mute on, so let's just get you unmuted. Just hold on a moment. There we go.
I had unmuted myself, but unfortunately I got remuted. So thank you for your introduction, Karen, and for to Ian for your opening presentation. As always, it's really interesting to see inside your mind and think about how you're seeing the future. Can you please move to the next slide, Karen? So I think probably we don't need to go through this except to say that for the last 20 years, I've been doing research on food, wine and agri-tourism. I started being a wine tourism researcher, particularly doing participant observation of wine tourism, which really meant going to wineries a lot. But since then, I've moved into looking at food tourism, but also working with farmers, particularly beef and sheep farmers in North Canterbury, looking at agri-tourism options. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do today briefly is just talk about some of the trends influencing opportunities as we see them. Firstly, obviously we're in a context where most tourism is domestic and will be for the foreseeable future. Ian had a presentation a couple of times ago around the economic recession and the impact of that on tourist behaviour. And I want to also add to that by talking a little bit about what I've described as the post-lockdown zeitgeist. Next slide, please. So obviously in this domestic context, we are talking a lot about pivoting towards domestic, but in this domestic context, Ian presented a newsroom opinion piece a month or so ago, where he looked at what were some of the trends that we can see happening in an environment where post-COVID-19 there will be a recession. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but just I do want to acknowledge that really it was Ian who was my starting point for thinking along those lines. Next slide, please. So what I've done is I've taken some of the ideas that Ian presented and then connected them up with what I've described as a post-COVID zeitgeist. And there was this article that I was published a few days ago, but I came across it yesterday from The Guardian, looking at what New Zealanders readers felt they would like to see change in their world post-COVID. And while we have to acknowledge that New Zealand readers of The Guardian may not be a representative sample of New Zealanders, I feel that some of the quotations from that article help to illustrate the points I'm going to make. Next slide, please. So bringing together the two sets of information, the information or the trends around what happens in a recession with the trends around the kind of post-COVID attitude or zeitgeist we're experiencing, I want to look at each of these together. So the first one is Ian has already talked today about the importance of connecting with roots. So in a recession, friends and family are seen as being more important, connecting with the people we love. And of course, in our experience post-lockdown, not only have we spent a lot of time with family, but we've also become acutely aware of those friends and family members who are not near us. And so in this environment, I think many of us are really wanting to connect with our friends, connect with our families. But at the same time, there have been other elements of our roots and identity that have come to the fore as well. And so I think this might be a time when we do want to continue with some of that family time. I think many of us were very excited when our children went back to school, but there were things about the lockdown and having our kids at home with us 24/7 that were actually kind of nice. You know, having time talking to them and going for walks with them, looking at the ducks and so on. But I think there are other elements of roots as well. So genealogical roots, thinking about our ancestry, but also connecting through to natural and cultural heritage. So what is it about being a New Zealander? What is it about being in this place that makes us special and the place special? Next slide, please. Another trend that Ian noticed or described was this idea about simplicity, that in a recession environment, there is a search for slow, for value-based holidays, for free times, for bargains, for spending time visiting friends and relatives because you can sleep on their couch for free. So those sort of issues around simplicity and the search of for slow experiences, again, in the post-COVID zeitgeist, I think you can talk about that in terms of also, I think many of us have really appreciated valuing our time and taking time to do things. So I often talk about the fact that during lockdown, there was a shortage of flour and yeast, but there was still bread on the shelves. We weren't buying yeast and flours because we needed to bake. It was because we wanted to bake. And I think that enjoyment of slow activities, slow tourism, slow travel, walking, cycling, gambling, and so slow food may be some of those elements that continue. And there's a couple of quotations there from the Guardian article which illustrate that point. Next slide, please. And I think another element of this slowness has been that connection with nature. And so many people have talked about the joy at seeing pī waka waka everywhere. I think the pī waka waka is, if it's not the front runner for Bird of the Year, I don't know what is, but it really has been quite a symbol for this slow times and the bird life. So connecting with nature, but learning about nature, and sort of also, I think, a sense of nostalgia for the way things used to be. You know, it used to always be quiet. You could walk down the street and so on. Next slide. And then the final point, that bringing together Ian's typology with some of the post-COVID trends, is this indication that there will be more people staying at home for breaks or staycations or having short breaks rather than going on long holidays. Now, that will be partly financial, but it may also be a part of the new ways of working. So there's talk about going to 4-day working weeks, which does give you those long weekends more often, perhaps, to get away. But there's also been a real strength and a pride in being part of this team of 5 million. So the first day of lockdown, I went out for a walk and I couldn't believe how many New Zealand flags were flying outside the houses of my suburb. At a level not normally seen unless there's an All Black Test match. But you know, people were really proud about their heritage. You had the teddy bear hunt. So a lot of issues around community and pride in being all in this together. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of opportunities for food and drink tourism, I think there are opportunities to connect to people, to heritage, to places, to socialise. By sharing food and drink. We know that sharing food and drink is such a part of hospitality or manaakitanga, to learn and also to pass on learning to new generations. So new skills, maybe cooking skills, maybe gardening skills, having new food and drink experiences and developing new cultural understandings. And a final set of options around opportunities to support local businesses and local communities. So carrying on from our lockdown experience, there's a lot of energy around buying local, shopping local, supporting our communities. So all of these things can be combined in memorable experiences that offer inclusive rather than exclusive food experiences as well. Next slide, please. So what demand might there be amongst domestic visitors? It's all very well coming up with these grand schemes and scenarios, but is there any evidence that domestic visitors may actually be interested in these kinds of experiences? Well, fortunately, last year I did a couple of surveys where we did have a set of questions in them about potential activities that could be available in this town and whether domestic visitors would be interested in participating in them. So the two towns were Kaikoura and Akaroa. They're not massive survey sample sizes. It was part of an international study, but we have 124 domestic visitors who, when asked how appealing the various activities were, rated them either extremely appealing or quite appealing. And I think a couple of things on that stand out in this context. One is a food tour around the region. So 21% of domestic visitors thought that a food tour would be extremely appealing, and a further 46% thought it would be quite appealing. And I think the other point I really want to point out there is the interest in Māori cultural tourism. I did some research on domestic visitors' interest in Māori tourism 15 years ago, and you were looking at maybe 2 to 5% of domestic visitors thought that during a tourist experience they would want a Māori cultural experience. The figures now is 18% of domestic visitors in Kaikoura thought a Māori cultural experience would be extremely appealing, and close to 2/3 thought it would be at least appealing to some extent. Next slide, please. So more recently in October 2019, that other survey was January, February 2019. This is October 2019. It's a smaller sample again. This is a sample of visitors from outside Banks Peninsula who were at the Akaroa French Fest. So obviously people who are interested in heritage to some extent. So we had a similar list of questions. The additional categories were ones that kind of suited the region or were asked for by stakeholders. But here we have two, particularly related around food. So a food tour of producers in the region. 34% said that would be extremely appealing, and that is not a typo. 63% said it would be quite or slightly appealing. So that's right up to 97% saw a food tour as appealing. I did go back and check those figures because they seemed very high. But the other one there is a food foraging tour. You know, you're looking at 85% thought a food foraging tour could be interesting. So, and again, just repeating there that the interest in Māori cultural experiences, 85% of this sample thought it would be interesting to some extent. Okay, so moving on, I just about run out of my time, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the forms that these experiences could take. So clearly bringing together those kind of trends, both in terms of what happens in a recession, but also bringing in a post-COVID, post-lockdown zeitgeist. There's lots of opportunities for gardening workshops, foraging tours, cooking classes, and there are many people already doing this. Next slide, please. There are also opportunities for large and small operators to provide food and drink experiences. I want to give a shout out to Terrace Edge in North Canterbury, a winery I've been visiting with my students for about 8 years. When I first started visiting it, it was literally just a shed. They have now decided to invest in more of a cellar door. They sell exotic toasties at $11 each. They have a food and wine tasting plate and bringing experiences that are not exclusive to visitors to North Canterbury. Next slide. And the third experience I just wanted to mention is Scotty Bee Tours. Scotty has a farm, his family has a farm in North Canterbury, and he's just started running tours on his family farm. They've had 130 years experience of farming there. And he said the very first time he had visitors out there to find out about this heritage, there was one thing that they liked more than anything else, and that was being able to pick pears from a 100-year-old pear tree. And that's the pear tree there. So, you know, there are ways of incorporating food and heritage into a lot of experiences. The final slide, and we'll scoot through this quite quickly. I just want to make the point though, not quite that quickly, that it is important that food experiences are not just seen as expensive experiences. So yes, you can buy a crayfish at $100. Yes, you can go to an expensive restaurant and buy exclusive French pate. Next slide, next thing, and the next one. But actually there are many other experiences, like a hangi. My daughter experiencing her first decent hangi, $10 per head, a great cultural experience. And the last slide. And we can't forget that actually when we talk about food experiences, for many people, fish and chips on the beach or an ice cream in the sunshine is a really special experience. So thank you very much for that, and I look forward to some questions later on.
Thank you, Jo. Just a reminder to everyone, we have got the questions open. We have no questions yet, so please somebody jump in and be the first there. You just go to the Q&A, which should be on the menu of your Zoom screen, and type in your question there. And we'll be looking forward to asking those to the panelists after our next presentation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sarah and welcome her to talk about food tourism's moment in the New Zealand sun.
Well, kia ora and tēnā koutou, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sarah, that sounds great.
Yeah, great. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Meikle and I'm the Chief Executive of the Wellington Culinary Events Trust. We're the organisation behind some of New Zealand's largest food and beverage events, including Visa Wellington on a Plate and Beervana. I'm really delighted to speak to you today, so thank you to Ian for inviting me to be part of this session. For those of you not familiar with our activities, in 2019, they collectively resulted in 350,000 culinary experiences being had across the month of August, right across the Wellington region. That all said, what the hell just happened? I don't think any of us could have quite predicted where we are right now back in March. And in fact, as we went into lockdown, we'd literally just finished the first round of Visa Wellington on a Plate program curation, and we were working with festival event and participant platforms to refine their applications. And then bam, everything came to a grinding halt. So it's certainly been a challenging few months since then, but we have come through, and yes, there is still a role for food festivals in this new world. But this time's also been a bit of a reflective one. And at the risk of sounding a bit cliched, I'm a big believer in opportunity coming out of adversity. And I do believe right now that New Zealand is on the precipice of an amazing opportunity around food tourism. So whilst we've all been hunkered down, learning the delights of sourdough bread making and the thrill of discovering your local brewery was delivering as an essential service, there had seemed to be somewhat of a dawning for many people, an appreciation of what was available right here in little old New Zealand. And since we've come out the other side of the lockdown, there's been a groundswell of support of things like Facebook groups endorsing Buy New Zealand Made. Finally, we may have reached the moment where our passion and love for New Zealand has outweighed tireless cultural cringe and an insatiable demand for all things imported or to emulate the food of other destinations. And this is the moment we can realise that we actually have the best in the world right here in New Zealand. Food is a major part of what defines us as Kiwis, but it doesn't get the same attention as other New Zealand cultural icons like bungee jumping, rugby, or even Crowded House. Food should be one of our great cultural markers as a nation, just as it is for other countries known for their cuisine like France or Italy. In New Zealand, food is intimately woven into our cultural identity, an integral part of what defines us as uniquely Kiwi. Food experiences are a connector, they're a community builder, they're a creator of shared experiences and memories. And food and hospitality are not just about sustenance. For many, it's about entertainment and learning, about our manaakitanga, New Zealand's hospitality, core to our culture and who we are. In my brief comments today, I want to give you some thoughts on food tourism in a practical sense, what's happening in New Zealand and how we harness the opportunity right now. This is New Zealand's food moment in the sun. Our audience is quite literally captive. There's no more time to wait. We just need to nail this and nail it now. Next slide, please. Here's one definition of food tourism from Gothenburg University, and it probably visually shows why food tourism is so hard to encapsulate in a singular one-line definition. In its broadest sense, food tourism isn't any experience where a consumer can have a taste or a taste of place of a product or ingredient that reflects the characteristics, the terroir of a destination. By this, I mean the ingredients that reflects the lands, the lakes, the rivers, oceans, and skies of a destination, and then how it's interpreted either through an agri-tourism experience, pick your own operation, right through to a farmer's market, food trucks, fine dining, an attraction that's got food and beverage offerings, a food festival, a food event, a culinary tour. Food tourism is where food connects us all and where we really come together and understand a destination's community, their society, and their culture. It's important because it contributes to the intangible heritage of a destination, and it's a unique point of differentiation from other places. No two destinations are the same when it comes to food. It also attracts visitors that spend more and who spread benefit right across the whole value chain. Food tourism is a great economic development driver for lesser visited destinations and communities, and it can help small-scale producers diversify their region and create lasting visitor loyalty to the place and the products produced. And probably most significantly, food tourism is widely accessible. Food tourism isn't just for foodies, it's for everyone. And the reason I wanted to share this definition with you is that food tourism is everywhere and we experience elements of it almost every day. For the most part, almost every New Zealander at some time or another is a food tourist. And Jo, our previous speaker, alluded to this and the opportunities around this in her presentation. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly cover three things, all appropriately starting with C, around COVID-19. There's some big and small ideas loosely around community, connection, and challenges. I don't think I've got time today to address everything. There are some really big issues around food with things like sustainability, the food system, food resilience, food security, and many other things. So today I'm just going to talk about food tourism and some specific opportunities and challenges that we have. Next slide, please. Firstly, community. That's us, New Zealanders as consumers of food tourism. In my day job, I think about food tourism every moment. When we established Visa Wellington on a plate, we set a bold vision for Wellington. We want Wellington to be New Zealand's most globally recognised food destination. We want to create world-class culinary experiences in Wellington. We're focused on pushing gastronomic boundaries and to be recognised for delivering the most innovative and original colouring events and festivals in the Oceania region, a global benchmark. We are squarely focused on the culinary tourism experience. Visa Wellington on a Plate was initially developed in 2009 as a joint venture by myself, then working for our RTO and our Regional Economic Development Agency to solve some very real issues in Wellington. We were dragging our heels through the end of the last recession and the winter months were positively dire. Accommodation and restaurants were really struggling. Not only that, there were so few opportunities for the wider food and beverage producing industry to connect with one another. Now in 2020, we all see ourselves facing a similar scenario. Food tourism is a way to reactivate communities through food. That's your local hospitality and restaurant operators, local producers and suppliers, and all the operators down the value chain. We've heard today the tourism sector has experienced the most profound shift in focus ever. From a tourism economy reliant on a large number of international visitors, now their focus is squarely on the domestic visitor. And it's fair to say the motivators for domestic visitors are quite different. Traditionally, aside from business travel, domestic visitors travel for two key reasons. Visiting friends and relatives, it's Aunt Carol's birthday or your cousin's wedding or a girl's weekend. Your motivation is the people before the place, but almost always the occasion centers around a meal or a food moment. And the other reason is an event, running a marathon, school holidays, a concert, or dare I say, a food festival. It's a real change in thinking for New Zealanders to start consuming New Zealand as a pure leisure destination. But we aren't competing right now with that trip to India or Japan or Alaska. We're all that's on offer, and New Zealanders need to view New Zealand through a different lens. What we know through the traditional domestic visitor is that food experiences form a key part of what they do, as they are widely accessible and already so many define a place. They visit the local farmers market, wineries, restaurants, breweries, or just soak up a location, as Joe mentioned, as they enjoy fish and chips on the beach. This is food tourism, and all communities can benefit. I just mentioned that food tourism offers great economic development opportunities for lesser visited destinations and communities, and it can help small-scale producers. This is where the rubber hits the road. What we need to do right now is develop this opportunity, mobilize our communities around New Zealand that are part of our food story, and tell people about what's on offer. Next slide, please. Connection is my next point. Our borders won't be, connection is about the long game. Our borders won't be shut forever, but while they are, let's get busy. This image was taken by Wellington business Fix and Fog Peanut Butter outside a Central Market supermarket in Texas in April, just after they started being stocked there. You can also buy Lewis Road Creamery butter there too. Now, before I am going to tell you that that going to the supermarket is a food tourism experience, stop right there, although going to Moore Wilson is often considered by many to be one, I wanted to talk around the connection between tourism and trade. For people who visited New Zealand, or in the domestic case, another region of New Zealand, being able to access our products at their local supermarket is about creating a lasting connection with New Zealand or a region. Not everybody who visits New Zealand will go home and buy a super yacht. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm aware of the importance of some of these high value industries to New Zealand, but we can create a lasting emotional connection with every single visitor to and around New Zealand through food. Buying Whittaker's chocolate at Sainsbury's in London or Garage Project beer at Dan Murphy's in Sydney's are just examples of this. These products tell a story of a sophisticated food producing nation that reflect a modern New Zealand. They also create a lasting visitor loyalty to New Zealand and the products produced here. Connection is also about leveraging our relationships right around the world, New Zealand and international chefs and personalities. During lockdown, many of you would have seen many-time #1 chef in the world, Massimo Bottura of Italy, espouse the virtues of New Zealand lamb, salmon, wine, and more on an episode of his kitchen quarantine on Insta TV. He's helping to do our job. He's never been here, and he's motivated, like many, to visit because of our superb ingredients. We need a stronger connection between New Zealand trade and tourism, and this moment in time marks an opportunity, as New Zealand is likely to become an even more desirable destination in the long term. Of the limited international visitor research in the food space, it indicates that visitors have very little knowledge or expectation of New Zealand food experiences outside of our traditional messaging around butter, Sauvignon Blanc, and things like green lip mussels. Next slide, please. There are a number of challenges, but I've really only got time to address one. The image on this slide says a lot. This is an image of New Zealand food that we have for so long taken to the world. Happy sheep on rolling hills. Yum. We love lamb, and gosh, what a pretty destination we are. But this also spells out our challenge. New Zealand doesn't have a defined food style, and we've let this be a barrier for far too long. Consider our recent history and colonial past. When the first European settlers arrived, rather than being influenced by Indigenous culture, they looked towards the motherland for culinary inspiration. And so the Sunday roast, meat pies, and battered fish and chips became pillars of what we define as iconic Kiwi food. And whilst modern British cuisine is now up there with the best in the world, it's fair to say that traditional British cuisine that influenced our recent culinary culture isn't known for its creativity or exciting flavours. But as a result of well over a century of immigration and our proximity to the Pacific and Asia, we have embraced many cuisines, as well as elements of Maori cuisine. These multiple influences mean we don't have a singular culinary cultural reference like other countries. We didn't invent pasta, curry, or sushi. Our multiple ethnic cuisines have created an incredibly vibrant and innovative food culture, but they have made it harder to cohesively define what New Zealand cuisine is. But New Zealand does have a food story. We are the youngest country on earth. Our relatively very recent history does mean that our food culture is still evolving. The challenge is for New Zealanders to understand and embrace our food culture. It's not just about pavlova, pineapple lumps, or jaffas. No, our food culture runs deeper than that. It's about our terroir, and not just the land that produces fabulous wine. It's about embracing our turanga waiwai, our place in the world, and having confidence in ourselves in New Zealand and what we produce. Above all, it's our connection to and understanding of our land, kaitiakitanga, looking at land not as owners, but as guardians, and not as separate from the land, but part of it. And it's partly because of our connection to the land, sea, lakes, and rivers that our produce is world class. our incredible kaimawana, our grass-fed beef, the best lamb in the world, and farmed and wild venison, and of course superb dairy, hops, apples, grapes, olive oil, peanut butter, and chocolate. And when you've got all these kinds of quality ingredients, we've learned not to mess around with them. Our food style doesn't masquerade as anything else. It respects the core ingredients, elevating them to another level. Our Maori culinary traditions also play a major role in what defines our distinct culinary culture. Methods of cooking like hangi and the use of indigenous ingredients like horopito, kawakawa, and manuka are all unique to us. But why are these herbs not readily available in a supermarket like Maggi, cumin, and cinnamon, oregano, and thyme? Our respect and understanding of where our ingredients have come from and who's grown them, our cultural references of New Zealand, Europe, and Asia, and throw in some clever and very risk-taking chefs into the mix, and that's when the different elements of our food story come together. New Zealand produces the world's best ingredients. They are our food story, and they set us apart. Right now is the moment that we need all New Zealanders to realise this. So to answer the question, what role will food play in the reimagination of New Zealand tourism post-COVID-19? No one loves New Zealand and our food more than our team of 5 million. They are the most patriotic ambassadors that we have. So it's time to harness that love, enthusiasm, and manaakitanga that New Zealanders have for our food and our country, and use them to help share our story with the world. We need to be proud of New Zealand food and beverage, celebrate them, support them, consume them, and make them truly ours. Appreciate truly Indigenous New Zealand ingredients and tell everyone, everywhere, all the time, just how good it really is. And just then we might find that we start appreciating what a fabulous food culture New Zealand really has, and just how proud we are of it, and realize that in fact we are the world's greatest food tourism destination. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Sarah. And if the promotion of food tourism is in your hands, we're in very good hands. Really passionate. Thank you. Well, now we have time for questions, and thank you to everyone who's been popping those into the Q&A section. Ian has been really busy typing some text answers to those, but don't worry, if you've moved into the answered section, I will draw on some of those as well. You can also upvote questions, and I don't think we'll get through everything that's being asked at the moment. So if there is one there you'd like to see answered, try and get it to the top, and I'll try and get that included. Now I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and so you can see our other panelists as well. Hopefully they've popped up there. And for our first question, I'm actually going to get to one of the answered ones. It was one of our early questions that we had, so I'm just going to have to scroll through and find it, from Fiona Newsom, who it's quite a long question, but I think essentially it touched on some of the things that Sarah, you were talking as Fiona was typing this, and you were talking about New Zealanders New Zealanders need to view New Zealand through a different lens. So Fiona's question, I think, really sort of boils down to that, you know, New Zealand's are very self-sufficient and independent. We often like to self-drive, navigate ourselves, but perhaps that independent culture might mean that we're missing out on some of these experiences, including food experiences. So, so how do you think you can manage that sort of seeing through a different lens? And Sarah, I'll throw it to you first.
Sure. I mean, I think actually a part of the job's done for us because we can't get out of here. So we are kind of stuck in New Zealand right now, and we, you know, as I said, we're literally being held captive. So I think actually we will see a natural shift. And I myself, I've just returned yesterday from a driving holiday around the East Cape of the North Island, and you know, of course, I had some great culinary experiences while I was there, but they weren't, you know, 5-star restaurants. They were fish and chips on the beach and a paua pie and a ham sandwich and a custard square. You know, those are the kind of the more quintessential experiences. So I suppose, but in terms of answering the question in terms of, you know, are we missing out? I think effectively people who have perhaps, you know, had their holiday plans otherwise curtailed will start looking at what the options are in New Zealand. I mean, I know lots of other people doing it, and I'm really excited about exploring what's out there, and food will become a very core part of that, because guess what? We've all got to eat.
Joe, can I bring you in? Andrew Clark has asked a question which I think really sort of links on from that, but particularly draws on your experience in working in rural regions and looking at the idea, and just a moment, his question was answered by Ian, so it moved off my screen, but this is really about how do we develop regional food tourism attractions, and whether or not that be Rotorua, Nelson, what are the sort of packaging points of difference, what can be offered?
Personally, I think there are lots of opportunities for regional food tourism. And I think a lot of regions are looking to food experiences in their offering. There are food festivals and events everywhere. I think one of the things that's really important is to make sure that the food experience you offer are unique, unique and authentic to the region you are in. So, different regions of New Zealand produce different food, that there is different terroir, and just as there are different wines in different regions. So if you're Havelock, then it makes sense to have mussels as a key component of the food you present, but if you are Hamilton, it may make less sense to showcase mussels. And I think leading on from that first question as well, yes, we are independent New Zealanders, travel on our own, but in some ways that makes us more likely to find out those special places behind, get behind front stage, because we are pottering around in farmers markets. We have the confidence to perhaps engage with locals because we do understand how things work. And so the lack of the kind of, I guess in tourism research, we talk about the environmental bubble, the fact that New Zealanders aren't traveling with a bubble and an entourage of kind of tour guides and interpreters means that we are closer to perhaps meeting those local people and getting those local experiences. Yeah, I think there are lots of opportunities for regional tourism and for telling regional stories. I think the stories and the narratives are really, really important, not just for tourism, but also for food provenance. So learning about the places where things are made helps you to have a connection with those places and people. And I know the farmers I'm working with in North Canterbury, a large part of the reason they want to get involved in tourism and agritourism is because they're really passionate about their land and they're passionate about their farm and their stories. And they want to show urban New Zealanders, the kaitiakitanga, what they're doing with their resources, with their environmental systems and so on. So, and I think that's answering one of the other questions there. So I think there's lots and lots of opportunities for those really one-on-one conversations between the producers and tourists.
Thanks, Joe. Ian, can I bring you in? There's a couple of questions that I'll sort of slightly merge, but they're around some of that sort of value chain side of things, both in terms of kind of how to connect sort of storytelling with an equitable value chain, but also looking at kind of how tourism businesses and food producers might be making decisions around what they focus on to attract. Is it a focus on cost cutting? Is it looking at discounts? What sort of revenue options might there be for in this area as well?
Well, I think that's a classical example of a revenue management decision, and I think businesses have to ask the question is, what is the value and what will that tourist pay for in the terms of price sensitivity? Because even if we're in a COVID-19 world, it just doesn't mean about heavy discounting and about giving something away. There is still a very, very, very solid market. So when it comes to experiences and value, there is a high end which you can protect. But you've got to remember, with food experiences like hotel accommodation, you don't have to price that one experience and have the same price all of the time of the year, every day of the week, and even by time of the year. There are very many principles from revenue management in the airline industry, hotel industry, when discounts are appropriate, but also when you can extend the price because of limited availability, of capacity, of the time of day. So it's a combination of both, but it's understanding when demand is in relationship to supply.
Thanks, Ian. I will just address there's been a couple of questions early on about the availability of the presentations. We will be taking the presentations and they will be uploaded to YouTube later, and we'll send out a link when all of that kind of curation has been done. So these will be available because I think there's some really great ideas that I'm sure you'll want to share more widely. I'd like to now turn to Sarah's question, which has been popularly upvoted, and this is looking at post-COVID. Do we think there'll be a change in perception from urban New Zealand around the dairy sector and see it celebrated more, both through food tourism, but also its key role in New Zealand's economy? I'll open that up. Who'd like to take that one first?
I would like to say something about that.
Yeah, let's go.
And just to start, I think there are many issues with New Zealand's dairy industry. I think in COVID-19, we've got to look at, we've got to position, we've got to look at the dairy industry as the problem. We have to look at the dairy industry as part of the solution. And therefore, with farming and the dairy industry in particular, it's how we can partner together in order to move forward in the terms of leverage. So that's my opening statement.
Thanks, Ian. Jo, does this feed into some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, I guess so. Sarah, did you have some thoughts as well?
All I was going to say is, I mean, I suppose getting into what I was saying before about people looking at domestic tourism, I mean, on-farm experiences are certainly popular. In fact, when I was in Gisborne, I did an on-farm experience, which is, you know, I would never normally do something like that, but it was fantastic. But I think, you know, just even in the last year, we've seen organisations like Fonterra do open days for people from the city to go to the farms, and they've proved hugely popular and sold out. So I do think there is an appetite, excuse the pun, for people to experience more on-farm types of experiences, whether that be dairy or otherwise. So, I mean, I suppose it's just we perhaps need to take a bit more time to explore what it is that they can offer and, you know, what people want. But I do think there is definitely an opportunity there.
Yeah, I can add to that as well that Lincoln University has a dairy open day, and I'm always really pleasantly surprised. There are hundreds of people, thousands come through and learn about dairy farming. And I think it's part of what I was saying about this intergenerativity. I don't think I use that term, but the idea of wanting to share things with the next generation. So, you know, I grew up with a pet lamb in Lincoln. There's no way in the world that my daughter's going to have a pet lamb in Lincoln now because there are 8,000 people. But you know, again, I think there is a sort of nostalgia for the way things were. And I think revisiting farms, you know, replanting vegetable gardens, teaching the next generation or our friends who may not have experienced it. I think there is a lot of people wanting to get back to some of those things, and, you know, taking kids to farms.
Yeah, don't underestimate how many people in New Zealand haven't been to a farm.
Yeah, yeah. But you're taking kids to farms, getting out to, I was really happy to see in Lincoln over lockdown that there were a lot of families just kind of, you know, poking at things in the river with a stick. And that was my entertainment as a child. There was no McDonald's or theme parks. Poking at things in rivers with a stick. You know, there'll be lots of opportunities to do that on farms or out in rural areas.
But also farms represent rural New Zealand. They represent that hinterland in terms of what we are. And it fits with some of the trends we've been talking about. You know, farming's about getting back to basics. Farming's about the outdoors. When we have times of crisis, we tend to go back to simplicity. We tend to go back to nature. We tend to go back, you know, that's the milk, that's the cow, that's the dairy. And it's that connectivity between where we come from and where we are. And farms represent that. And within that, you know, if you just watch Country Calendar during the week, there's always that strong connection between this is the farm and this is the food we offer.
I call it the New Zealand food show.
to the rest of the world, to the rest of New Zealand. And that's that connectivity that we've got. And it can be everything extremely niche, from mozzarella cheese to beetroot to specialist sheep or whatever. There's a connection there in the terms of the location and the place and the provenance of what draws.
I did a study in Selwyn District last year, asking food producers about, you know, what was the food identity of Selwyn. And it was really interesting. There was quite a big distinction between those people up in the high country or, you know, Lake Coleridge sort of area and the people down sort of Rolleston, Christchurch end of the district. But up in the mountains, you know, it was all about, this is our heritage. This is the New Zealand heritage, the story of big sheep and beef farms and pastoral farming and arable farming. And, you know, and I think it is a really important, the fact that Country Calendar, when I was growing up, it was Country Calendar and a dog show. I mean, that was my appetite. That was TV viewing when I was growing up. And I think there is a sense that, you know, getting back to the nature. And we know that actually hands in the soil is one of the best things for mental health. Actually being grounded in that way with the land, with the soil, is really good for mental health as well.
Jo, I think that's a fantastic point to close on, and we have run out of time. There are a few questions we haven't yet got to, but we always do download the questions and share them with our panelists as well, so they can see the other questions being answered. I will also give a shout out to, I think it's Gareth, who sort of suggests a twist on 100% pure being 100% tasty, which I thought was quite a nice turn as well. But I would like to thank our three presenters today, Ian, Jo and Sarah. I think it's been a fantastic insight into food tourism and some of the opportunities that those present, focusing on New Zealand, but I think there's a lot we can take and learn more globally as well. Thank you for everyone for attending as well. I will just finish by sharing what's coming next in our webinar series. Next up is Smart Tourism and the New Era of Tourism with Professor Dimitris Bouhalis. He's director of the e-Tourism Lab at Bournemouth University in the UK, and really a leading expert looking at technology and tourism. Obviously, he's coming in from the UK, so we've got a bit of an earlier start for this one. It's on Thursday, the 25th of June, 8:30 to 9:30. You can register for this and also future webinars on our website, which is down there at the bottom. It'll be the same one where you probably saw a link to this webinar. And we do have some others coming up in the future, looking at value-based pricing and revenue management in July, and they'll be followed by some others, including looking at responsible tourism and Maori perspectives as well. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for the team behind, particularly Abby, who's kept things moving. It's been a pleasure to chair today's session. Kia ora koutou. Thanks, everyone.